Hey, welcome everybody. My name is Dave Bailey. I want to thank you for joining us. This is Grief and Grace. Like most people, I've had my own deep personal experience with grief, and in my work with the largest provider of funeral services in North America, I spend time with grieving families on a daily basis. And so out of that awareness, this Facebook Live was created to be one of the spaces and one of the voices helping to process a little bit of that common human experience. My guest tonight is Kevin Carter from Uplift in Philadelphia. We're going to be talking about everything from children in grief to family systems to support groups for African American males in the grief and trauma space. And I know that it's going to be fascinating and informative. And if you know someone that you think could benefit from the ideas that we're talking about here, why don't you go ahead and tag them in the comments so that they get a notification they can come and join us. And if you just want to jump on and leave your name or leave a comment so that we know you're here watching with us, that would be awesome. Also, if you have a question during the show, just put it in the comments, and we'll take some time to answer as many of those as we can before we sign off. All right. Kevin Carter. Kevin is the clinical director at Uplift, does social work education as part of the adjunct faculty at Lasalle University, and has been doing training and consulting since 1995, and I am honored to have him with us here today. Welcome, Kevin.
David, thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm very grateful to have spent a couple of days getting to know you and also beginning to see the kind of work that you're doing across the country and in the community to support grieving children and families. So I'm just grateful for today. I would like to say I want to give a shout out to all the families in Philadelphia who are dealing with grief, loss, and trauma in very significant ways. And they're doing that with a lot of courage and a lot of commitment. So I wanted to make sure I said that from the beginning, as well as the people who are helping us do this work to support them.
Yes.
So,
thank you. Thank you, my brother. So let's start with that then. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Uplift and the role that you play there and the work that Uplift is doing in the Philadelphia community?
So the Uplift Center for Grieving Children, we're actually we'll be celebrating our 20th year this year, and we have essentially three pillars of our program. The one that I'm primarily responsible for is called Family Services, and in Family Services we provide grief support groups for children and their caregivers. Focuses on caregivers because lots of times, we have grandmothers, fathers, mothers, aunts, uncles, and other people who are supporting us and supporting the children. So we don't necessarily say parents. We say caregivers. We are simultaneously offering support groups for those children as well as those caregivers. A lot of what we focus on is helping them to understand what grief means to them, looking at what their grief journey is about in terms of how they're coping, and really join with other people to get that peer support. We really talk about the fact that we don't really do counseling and therapy. It's really focused on peer support, but also we focus on helping caregivers if they need additional services. A lot of our families are not just dealing with grief, they may be dealing with food insecurity, transportation issues, employment, so we're trying to support them in that as well. So that's the one pillar of the program. Second pillar is school and community services. And that program actually goes out to hundreds of schools in the city of Philadelphia and provides peer support groups for those children in those schools. Both of those programs cover children from the ages of 5 up to the ages of 18. We really focus on children that are in kindergarten going up to the 12th grade. And a lot of those groups are, again, in the schools, but also school and community services works in some of the juvenile justice facilities across the city. They also engage in crisis work. So one of the challenges that we're facing in the city of Philadelphia right now is a significantly high and traumatic murder rate.
Yes.
And part of what our staff do is to provide services for those children who are coping with that, but also some very specific groups for people who are connected closely to those young people. We also work with one of our partners called Network of Neighbors to provide crisis support and other support services for individuals, families, and organizations who are coping with COVID and all the other kind of losses that are impacting the city. The last pillar of our program is training. We have a training coordinator that provides training for many of the school personnel. We also train other organizations and facilities. And basically what we're trying to do is we're trying to connect with people around coping with loss, coping with grief. One of the things that our program is really proud of is that we pivoted in the COVID space and began to provide online training around coping with grief, loss, and trauma. But also, several months ago, there was a new program developed called Hope Line Philly. And that is a line that is open to the general public to call in and talk about some of the challenges they may be having in terms of being lonely, being sad, dealing with grief, and dealing with trauma. So we're very proud of that service as well.
Wow.
So all three of these pillars come together to form what we believe is a very significant partnership with the families in Philadelphia, but also with the other agencies that do trauma and loss services in the city. So we're not the only person, but we feel like we're a strong pillar in that support that families need in our city.
Yeah. Wow. So what are some of your guiding ideas when it comes to grief and loss?
Yeah, another great question. One of the things that I've been thinking about probably over the last 10, 15 years in my work is that everyone comes to counseling, support, and helping with some kind of loss. And I think that's really come more into focus over the last several months because, when we talk about death, dying, grief, and loss, when I first entered the field, probably back in 1995, a lot of what we would talk about are the forgotten mourners. And at that point, the forgotten mourners were children. And people really began to focus in on children, but also we started to focus in on caregivers. And a lot of the challenge that I think I've had over the last 20 years or so is getting people to focus on that loss when it doesn't necessarily pertain to them. So I think part of what the moment that we're in now with COVID, dealing with institutional racism, dealing with the loss of the loss of a lot of people of color in terms of diseases and extrajudicial losses and those kinds of things. I think what's really important for everyone to understand now is this is something we need to talk about. Not only talk about, but we need to take action. And one of the ways that I found very useful in terms of trying to frame everything that's going on, particularly when it's related to death loss, is to really look at the task of mourning that Warden oftentimes talks about. There are 4 of those tasks, and I won't go all the way through those because one can easily look those up. But one of the things that we did when we redeveloped our curriculum about a year or so, or probably about 2 years ago now, is to figure out what our themes were. So if we're having a caregiver group as well as a child's group, what we want to be able to do is to be able to support that child and support that caregiver. And then when they leave the group, they actually can go with each other and talk about the theme. So let's say the theme is accept the reality of the loss. If you really think about when someone dies and when you lose someone, it has an impact on your mind, your body, and your spirit. But there's also some very practical things that that family may be dealing with. It might be funeral rites. It might be moving because the one caregiver that was deceased or the one person that was deceased no longer can financially help that family. So what we're trying to say is accepting that reality of the loss is an immediate issue, but it's also a lifetime issue. The next issue that Worden talks about is processing the pain. So again, if you go back and you look at mind, body, and spirit, and you start to talk about feelings, one of the things that we understand is that when that family comes to us, they're already in the grief process. The caregiver may call us because that child is having difficulty sleeping. That child may not be reacting to the loss and the death in a way that the parent thinks that they may need to be. So what we're trying to do is look at how that person is managing that pain. We don't not only look at that individual, but we're looking at how are things going in school, how are things going at home, and how are things going in the community. Because if you think about what's happening in our city right now, there's a significant amount of pain because of the murder rate, the COVID-19 rate, and those kinds of things. So we have to recognize that there's pain, and we have to recognize that people are processing that pain in different ways. The third piece is how does that family and how does that child adjust to life without that person being there? One of the things that I remember from one of my first weeks and probably months at Uplift is a child who had lost his grandfather. And his grandfather used to be the one that picked him up from school, used to be the one that would take him to outings, used to be the one that he spent a lot of time with. So part of what we had to do is to listen to how that child was adjusting, but also how is the family system and the community system around them adjusting? And how do we help that child adjust to that pain, that reality, and around the fact that that physical person is not there. Last piece of this, I said I wasn't going to go through all four, but I'll go ahead and talk about that anyway. How does that person enter the new parts of their life and keep a connection to the deceased? Sometimes people come to us, and part of what they're struggling with is how do I keep their memory alive? Other people might forget about them, but how do I remember them? One of the great things that we've done in the past is working with young people and family around building memories. So let's say, for example, the child's younger and they don't have that many memories about the loved one. Part of what we try to do is work with the caregiver to figure out, okay, so how can we bridge that gap? Do you have pictures? Do you have things in the home that you can share so that that child, as well as the family, can keep that connection to the deceased, even though they're not physically there?
Wow. So there's this, it's interesting listening to you talk and thinking about this conversation all day long, thinking about Uplift, thinking about there's a little phrase in the scripture that says a little child will lead them. And I wanted to ask you this question. I've not asked anyone a question quite like this before, but what have the children taught you about grief?
I love that question. And I think it follows along with what you just talked about in terms of that scripture. One of the biggest things that I say to my staff, and I say to the caregivers, and I say to the children, is that there are powerful human beings within their own right. So you have a 5-year-old that comes to group. And they're operating at a 5-year-old level, but their ability to show us how they are coping with the loss of that person is very significant, because I think part of what we've been able to do a much better job, particularly through organizations like the National Alliance on Grieving Children, is to get adults to put themselves in a position where they can understand the power of a child. So that child might not tell you what's going on, but they may show you what's going on. It's really important to listen to what they say, but also what they might not be saying. So what children have helped me to do is to be able to work with my staff and also work with caregivers to figure out how to listen and get to where children are. I'm 58 years old, but I need to be able to understand what a 17-year-old is telling me about their grief. And again, they might not be telling me in words, but they might be telling me in the ways in which they ask for a certain piece of music to be played, in the ways in which they engage with us around Skype.
Yes.
Oftentimes young people, they don't want to be seen on the camera, but they will still say and do what they need to do to make the group work. So one of the things that is overwhelmingly an issue for me is that these children are way more courageous than we give them credit for.
Wow.
Because I want to give you another example. We always talk about creating safe space. So one of the things that we have is we have some guidelines that we utilize in group. And oftentimes what happens is if we forget one of those guidelines, the young people remind us, Mr. Kevin, you told us that you could pass and you don't have to talk, but you're trying to make her talk. Mr. Kevin, don't do that. So their courage and their integrity is very significant. And the other part of this too is that what we find in our group process is that we'll have young people who will return to those groups. And what they do is they bring in the new members, wrap them in care, and wrap them in the process, because one of the number one things that people say about our group work is people start to feel like they're not the only one.
Wow.
Imagine being in a school, whether it's a large school or whether it's a small school, and your parent died. And in many ways, you may be getting teased, or you may be getting your feelings hurt, and people don't really understand what's going on with you. But when you join with other people who are there for the same reason that you're there for, I think kids help us hold up this process with a lot of integrity.
That is true.
Yeah. So I mean, I can't say enough about the courage that they bring to the picture. And I think the other part of this too is the children oftentimes help us understand the caregivers better, because they're reflecting the lessons that they learned at home. Even as we move through the group process, how much is the child able to share their memories with their loved one, with their caregiver? How much is the caregiver able to share with them? So it allows us to honor that child-adult process in a way that I think we're very proud of.
Wow. One of the things we talked about the other day was about not giving people your vocabulary of grief, but allowing them to develop their own. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, yes, I will. I think, and I want to speak to being in the African American community a minute here. Part of the struggle is being always told what to think, being told where to be, and being told how to be. And because of that, I believe that we need to support people in developing their own narrative. So instead of telling history, tell your own story. tell your own story in your own image and interest, because lots of times, particularly with our community, our history and who we are is literally buried right under our feet. So I think part of what motivates me in my work is trying to help people build their own story. So that might sound like I'm asking people to only be verbal, but what if your story is, I'm going to paint on my cleats my loved one's name?
Mm.
And what if that means I'm going to dedicate my performance, my literature, my poetry, my writing? What does that mean? Because if we're trying to tell people what grief is, then they may lean not to their own understanding, but they may lean to our understanding to please us.
Yes.
In terms of what we say.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the things that we really have to watch, is people pleasing and performing because of a certain standard that we set up. So we are fine if someone comes to group and their narrative is silence.
Mm.
Because that may mean that they are going home thinking, writing, contemplating, and working on their grief process. And if society says, no, they're not grieving, we don't want to be involved in that at all.
Mm.
Also, we're trying to get people to consider that their way of social organization, which is like, how do they compose family? Who's important in their grief process? If we tell them that, then we're already screening out somebody that might be important to them.
Mm.
So part of that narrative is how do you organize yourself socially? How do you organize yourself economically? Because in the field that you're in, you understand that the burial, funeral process and other processes are economically challenging for some people.
Mm-hmm.
But how can that family work with the funeral home? How can they work with other people to give that person the kind of homegoing or kind of service or funeral rights that they actually deserve? So if we're prescribing grief looking a certain way, we might miss out on how Muslim families interact with the person who is dead, how they arrange their rights and the kinds of things that we do. So I believe that the less prescriptive we are, the more that we will get from the hearts and stories of the people that we serve. And that's one of the things that we focus with on our staff and intern, is that we're in service.
Yes.
To families. And we're not just in service to families, we're actually co-creating this experience along with them so that it can be something that they find useful and healing themselves.
Yes. But I love that. I love that you said it starts with listening and really
Mm-hmm.
listening, and then
Mm-hmm.
and then not giving people the rules, not giving people the parameters, so that we don't screen out. I love that. There's some incredible ideas in there. Let me ask you about this. I know that you're also working in the area of training and support. You're doing support groups. Part of the work that you do is helping people whose memory of their person might be clouded by some kind of trauma, whether it was suicide or homicide or the intervention of law enforcement or abandonment or some kind of social injustice, and helping them access their memories and their emotions in a beneficial way, so that they can actually process their grief.
Yes. One of the things that it's interesting is that we start everything with the notion that we, again, are the listeners, but also we are coming from the perspective that the person is there again for us to serve. So with that, with the trauma-informed perspective, what we're trying to do is we're trying to create rituals for safety. So for example, if, we'll do a registration or an intake with the family, they'll tell us a lot of details about the loss and the death. But when we come into the group space, we don't demand that. So you get to tell what you want to tell, how you want to tell it, in the most safe way possible. So if you were in a group with me as a caregiver, I would never ask you how your person died. I would give you the opportunity, along with the other group members, to identify that. Because part of what happens is that we're trying to create a situation where people can regulate their emotions, regulate their thoughts, and regulate their behavior in a way in which they can stay in group and be in group. But part of what we also do is that when we have that group process, we're following up with that family. So for example, let's say a child hasn't talked a lot about that loss, and then they come in the group and they begin to talk about their loss. And then you see some regression in their behavior at home. Maybe it's some bedwetting. Maybe it's they're talking less, or maybe their behavior becomes more elevated. What we're trying to do is to take that child and that family where they are and begin to support that caregiver in supporting that child in different kinds of ways. So let's say, for example, they used to do bedtime stories and they stopped doing those. Maybe they can go back to those. Maybe the child does need to see their physician because there actually may be some physical issues going on. So what we're trying to do is to have people understand their own story, develop their own narrative, and then if there's more significant trauma, we're trying to find that support for them in the grief process. Part of what we're starting to get better at too is assessing adult and child responses to the loss, and really beginning to integrate those into how we set up groups, but also how we do our follow-up and how we do our case management with family.
Wow. I love when you talk about the vocabulary of grief and the narrative of grief. Could you just unpack a little bit more around that idea of the narrative of grief?
Let's see, what part of that haven't I covered? One of the things that we do is that we know there's some common themes in grief. So for example, we might say that grief is individual. We might say grief is universal. But what does that mean to a brother and a sister who are grieving the same loss, but they have a different relationship with the person who's deceased? Part of what we're trying to do is to say to Johnny and Susie, you have your own way of seeing this, and we need to honor that.
Yes.
But we're also trying to say to the caregiver that your child may not be able to understand what that grief looks like developmentally. So we may have to choose different words to get them to understand what a cremation is. Mm-hmm. We may be able to use different words when we're talking to that 15-year-old about a homicide versus a 5-year-old that is dealing with a homicide, because developmentally they're going to process that information at a different place. But also there are certain kinds of things that the family wants to share with that child, and we're trying to support them at the level at which they're at. So let's pull out the word grief, for example. Somebody might say to me, I'm sad and I'm feeling like I can't get out of bed. I'm not going to tell them that's grief, man. That's depression. I'm going to listen long enough so that they can hear what it is that they're saying and then give them some general feedback. So we use a general definition of grief. But if that doesn't fit for the person, it doesn't fit for the person. So, for example, I don't use the word closure because I see grief as a lifetime process.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm working with somebody and they say, I want closure, Mr. Kevin. I'm not trying to talk about this when I go back to school. I'm not trying to feel this when I go back to school. And I'm certainly not trying to show my buddies this. So as time goes on, I can work with that young person and say, okay, so what does that closure look like to you? Does that mean you need to close it down when you get on the court? Or do you turn it on when you get on the court? Because that motivation behind you and remembering that person might make you jump a little higher or block a little better, write a little better. So I'm always working with them to develop their own language. Like I told you, I'm 58. I don't know all of the new slang. I don't know all of the inner communication between young people. I'm trying to get them to teach me so I can talk the language that I need to talk to be able to support them and guide them. One of the things we always talk about is like, when you're having a group, do you go tell your buddies you went to grief group? Lots of times you don't say it. I went to group, or I went to this thing, or I went to a meeting. So I'm not going to walk up into, Children's Hospital and start saying, grief group starts in 5 minutes. I'm saying, my people, come on, let's go. We're getting started. So a lot of this is understanding the language that we bring as professionals, but always catering that language so we do no harm to people, but also we open the tent more widely so that they can do grief in their own way.
Wow.
Hopefully that helped you.
No, totally. And I know that you have begun, I don't know how long this has gone on for you, but I know that you provide support groups in the grief and loss space for adult African American men. That is what's that? How is it working in that community? I mean, a male community, a community that's been marked by grief. Tell us a little bit about that experience and where you're going with that and how that is impacting lives.
So I'll talk about that in two ways. We have a growing percentage of African American men who attend our groups and at Uplift. And one of the things that we find is, and this is overwhelmingly so, once those men show up, they participate at a level that some people find surprising, but we really don't find it surprising.
Wow.
Because they're showing up for their children. And what we find with caregivers in general is oftentimes they come in the process showing up for their children. But what we're trying to say is you're 100% important, and your child and your grandchild and your niece and nephew are 100% important. So part of what I have done in the past in my own private practice and part of what I'll be doing in the future is really working in trying to create spaces for African American men, but also African American families that honors people's history, their spiritual lives, the way they socially organize, and the way that they use their creativity to cope in this world. I've been doing this since 1995, and part of what continues to motivate me is how do I work to create spaces where organizations, individuals are really responding to families in ways that are healthy. So, for example, one of the things that people sometimes find irritating when they're working with me is I want to know your story. So if you have an organization that's serving African American families, I want to know how you do that. I want to know how you do that in a unique way. And I want to know how you want to do that differently to honor our place in this country and in this world, which is in many cases pushed to the margins, denied adequate services, and treated in ways that are subhuman. Because this is one of my greatest pleas and one of my greatest hopes is that in this work, in the next 10, 15 years, part of what the sad reality is that this grief and loss work may need to serve to humanize us more as a people.
Yes.
And to harden and to lessen those hardened and steadfast ideas about the fact that we tolerate more pain. We can bounce back quicker than anybody else. Those things are myths that get in the way of people doing the work. So part of what I've tried to do over the last several years as well is to try to make that bridge between what's grief and what's trauma. And really beginning to work with the people that I supervise, as well as people that I do training and consulting with, is to look at, okay, not just the origins of enslaved Africans in the world and in the United States, but what happened before that? What is being covered up so that we really don't see our greatness? What is it about that grief story that we need to tell? Africans in America before Columbus. How do we discover that? How do we look at Tulsa, where where there was a riot, and they're just beginning to uncover those graves and uncover the atrocities that happened in that city. So one of the issues is helping people to unpack those realities.
Yes.
And part of that is people understanding their own relationship to people of color, their upbringing. What were you taught about African American children? Were you taught that 5-year-olds were just as assertive as a 15-year-old? Or were you taught to be afraid of African American men, African American women, children? How do you work through those stereotypes while you're trying to serve people at the highest level? So part of what I'm trying to do in my practice, which I'm calling it Belonging, Loss, and Freedom Intervisions.
Wow.
So my website will be BLF Intervisions, and really it's trying to get folks to see themselves and to see us as belonging to someone and somebody in our families, in our inner circles when we're born. And then really looking at how loss, and that might be loss through death, it might be loss through separation, it might be loss through prison, it might be loss through other means, but really trying to figure out how to bridge that loss by supporting people and finding the freedom to express themselves, the freedom to be in space. One of the things that we see, particularly with African American gatherings, is people are like, why don't you all be quiet? Why don't you calm down? It's too many people. One of the persons that you have coming on, Dr. Bourdaire, has done some research on how in hospitals, oftentimes people of color, particularly African American families, may gather in that hospital setting in ways that other families don't. But oftentimes the perception is there's too many of you here.
Mm.
There's too much noise. So how do we work with all kinds of disciplines to figure out how do we support African American people in their loss journey and in their grief journey? And that really means unpacking all systems, not just systems that are in grief and loss, but school systems, governing systems, policing systems, and looking at how all of that impacts how children grieve, how families grieve, how communities grieve, and how people grieve overall.
And how cultures are
Yes.
are endemically grieving.
Yes.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. And that's part of the challenge too, is that how do we, if you look at the incident this morning, I think it was last night in Wisconsin, and the young people observed their father being shot
7 times.
And I believe that right now he's still living. But how do you work through that trauma, but also that loss of how those young people will see policing,
Yes.
how they will see their father, how they will see safety from here moving forward?
Yes.
And part of what I really encourage people to do and push people to do is to really reconcile your desire to look away from that.
Mm.
Because if we ask young people and caregivers to look into that, how can we look away?
Yes.
Because the key to what we do is we offer people a space and they show up. And by showing up, they are being courageous and on point to what the work is. Of course, we may want people to talk more or talk less or do more or do less, but their showing up acknowledges the humanity of the person who is deceased, but also that humanity and spirit of that family and that connection. And so we have to be able to honor that by not necessarily matching that, but be willing to take on the tough things that our families have to face every day.
Yes.
And that's hard work for people.
Yes. I there's so many things that I love about what you said. We could just unpack so many of those things. Creating space, allowing people to show up, listening, not giving them their narrative, letting them, it's just, we're kind of running out of time. But you told me a story the other day. I want you to tell everybody, and we'll kind of bring this to a close. We've been talking about vocabulary and narrative, and you told me a story that really moved me. So I want you to go ahead and share that.
Okay. I'm going to go ahead and read it.
Okay.
Because I haven't memorized it. And I want to share with you and the audience a piece called Water Boy.
Yes.
I wrote this piece quite some time ago, and it was really dedicated to my relationship with my grandfather on Joe Benny Strother on my mother's side. So let me share this with you. Water Boy. Tiny little boy sitting at his grandpa's feet, not knowing much about life, basically into food, play, and drink. He found himself a role one day, maybe even a little job, one might say. Something real important to be. His granddaddy penned him with a name. Real simple, but made him whole and complete. He called him Water Boy, that is. Whenever Granddaddy would thirst, he would raise his voice with a loud outburst. Water boy! Water boy! The boy would scramble and bring the taste, spilling and dripping along the way, working hard for that joyous little payday. Money was not what he found, but just to see his granddaddy's joy was his crown. Even the toothless smile would make his heart smile. One day, Granddaddy left, and the little boy got his first taste of unemployment. All that was left were his clothes and stuff. Granddaddy went to live somewhere else, but the little one was too young to get that. He just knew that he could no longer do his job. Stripped of his crown and title, he wandered around, looking for Granddaddy and something to fetch, searching for a person to be and not left. Soon Granddaddy died, and many other things changed. The little boy's dream of making someone happy at some level went away. A hope of being close and having an old granddad disappeared. But today, that little boy has grown, and he still seeks to help others create joy and happiness. Although he knows that won't bring Granddaddy back.
Wow. Kevin, I am honored. Thank you for sharing that. God, that just resonates with me in such a deep place. Oh. I'm so thankful that you took time to be with us tonight. You said a lot of things that were incredibly important that I really appreciate. And I know that this conversation will help a lot of people. So thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being a part of tonight. Yeah. All right. So again, it is the Uplift Center for Grieving Children. And the website address is www.upliftphilly.org. So you can see it up there on the screen just now. And you can see there's lots of resources, view resources and activities designed to bring calm. There's all different things. Please go and take advantage of that. And even after this live is over, you can still leave comments or questions, and I'll be coming back to review the comments and interact with you as we go forward. Don't forget to click on notifications so that you can get a reminder when we're ready to go live. And please feel free to share this live on your social media platforms. And you can also find all these conversations archived on the Grief and Grace page. So, as you've been listening, if you think to yourself, I just have this person that I would love to hear this conversation, you can go to YouTube, type in Grief and Grace. All of the conversations that we have are both streamed live to YouTube, but they're also archived there on the Grief and Grace page. And next Monday at 6 p.m. Central Time, our guest will be Dr. Lasalle Bourdaire. As Kevin was saying, Dr. Bourdaire is an assistant professor at the University of Missouri, and she has a research specialty focusing on death, dying, and bereavement, especially in the African American community with African American children, youth, and families. It is a timely conversation to have. It is an amazing conversation to have, and I am humbled and honored to be able to center a voice like Kevin tonight and center a voice like Dr. Bourdaire and have them, just enrich our lives with that. So that's next Monday, Dr. Lasalle Bourdaire from Mizzou, and looking forward to see you then. All right. Stay safe, everybody. Yeah, we'll see you next Monday.